Hey there, this is Salgood Sam, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to a special edition of the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. You have a comment, criticism, or question, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. These podcasts are dedicated to the exhibitors who would have participated at the 2020 Montreal Comic Arts Festival. MCAF is a leading platform from the comic arts in Quebec and beyond to broaden public knowledge of and engagement with the comic arts and to promote cultural exchanges and interactions between creators, readers, and the public at large. On this episode, I chat with Salgood Sam. The podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. Salgood, aka Max Douglas, published comics and zines in the late 80s and started making comics professionally in the early 90s. His work has been published notably by Image, IDW, Marvel, and DC. And outside of comics, his clients have included the Criterion Collection, Bravo TV, Nokia, Novana Studios, and Fox, among many others. Sam also teaches art part-time. One of his current projects is Mind Engine. So, without further ado, here's my chat with Salgood Sam. Salgood Sam, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Oh, hi, thanks for having me.
What I usually do to start off the interview is ask a creator about their first comic book. So I'm wondering if you remember, what was the first comic book you read?
I don't think I could actually say, because I kind of grew up with comic books being around, and so that predates my memory. But I can tell you the broad strokes. My father mainly was the one who introduced comics to me, although my mother was really into comics and cartooning, and she's a professional artist. But my dad actually had collections of both underground comics and superhero comics around. There was always a stack of them in his bathroom at his house. So, I mean, that it would be a mix of, I know X-Men were in there. One of the first comics I bought myself was the giant size X-Men when they rebooted the team. There was also the underground comics, so like Zap and Wonder Warhog and crazy stuff, and then heavy metal and a lot of other fantasy magazines and stuff. So a kind of mix of all that stuff. I think one of the first ones that made an impression on me, like it's been a visual image that stuck on me, was Creepy, and specifically a Frank Frazetta story called, I think it was called Werewolf. And the drawings of the wolf on a hill overlooking the victims kind of burned itself in my brain.
Yeah. Very memorable, that's for sure. Yeah. So I'm wondering who or what inspires you today to create?
Just wanting to tell stories, I think, is the main thing. Like, who would be hard, because I have a really broad palette of tastes and different media that I look at for ideas and influences. So that would be a very long list. But I think at some point around the mid-90s, I realized I was more of a storyteller than a cartoonist. Mm-hmm. And so it's mostly, despite the financial frustrations of the comic book market, I keep doing it because I like to tell stories. So
sure. Yeah. Cool. Now I'm talking to you and others under the context of the Montreal Comic Arts Festival that didn't happen this year.
Yeah, and so CanCaf too, generally.
And yeah, right? There's a lot of them that just did not happen. So I'm wondering, what project did you have in the go this year that you were planning to showcase?
So I was going to put out the first issue of a new personal anthology series called Mind Engine, and I'm still planning on putting that out, but I decided to sit on it and just keep adding new stories to it, so it's going to probably be a much bigger book when it's finally released next spring. But that was the goal. I've been doing something like it with a series called Revolver for a while, but for long-winded reasons, I decided to rebrand and reboot it. And so that's what's on the slate for now. And it'll contain a bunch of standalone short stories, but also book 2 of Dream Life, a graphic novel I put out in 2014, in serial. So I'll be doing installments. I think the first 30 or so pages is going to be in Mind Engine 1. And also some other projects that I've written for myself. There's a science fiction one, there's a weird sort of fantasy one that's kind of inspired by things like Dark Crystal, but is actually riffing on. It's actually a project. I teach comics, and I was trying to come up with suggestions for students who were having a hard time thinking of plots. And one of them was to take something like a Brother Grimm's fairy tale and strip it of the specific stuff and use that plot structure as a something to hang your own ideas on. So come up with your own characters for the roles and the specific settings and world building, but then employ, which is, I mean, this is what Disney is even more overt, but it's basically what Disney does with all of their fairy tale stories, where they usually take a standing folklore or fairy tale that's in public domain and will rejig it to be a Disney tale, but they're essentially borrowing the plot. What they do in the end, the characters may have the same name, but they're seldom have a lot to do with the original version. But I was kind of going further, so I took something that's called the Tinderbox, which is a Hans Christian Andersen tale, and I'm turning it into this weird, Dark Crystal-esque fantasy. There's no humans in it, and especially after, like, if anyone goes out looking for that one, it's a weird and kind of unsettling story, and so I saw lots of potential there for that. There's other stuff too. I'm also working on a memoir series about my childhood. There's a bunch of little standalone short stories that'll be in there. The first two are in Revolver Zero, but I'm going to continue doing it.
So you're keeping busy, that's for sure. Yeah. Yeah,
probably a little too busy. There are other things I'm up to too, and I'm always considering, like, I may have bitten off more than I should chew.
Well, maybe you can step back a bit and talk about your creative process. Can you walk me through how you go from initial concept to the finished page?
There isn't really like one way. This is the thing. I think I've talked to other artists about this, and a lot of us, this is true. Like, some writers are a little more probably, especially if there's someone like, say, Stephen King, for example. He's such a workman about it, so he has this very disciplined daily process he has, and to facilitate that, from what I've read, he's got a pretty fixed process. I'm a constant student. I'm always experimenting and trying new things out, and part of that probably comes from the visual art side of things. We were recommended when I was getting into commercial art in the late 80s and 90s. You were always told that you should always have, like, develop a style and stick to it, brand your work, and that just struck me as boring. And I saw validation for that necessarily being always the best idea, and people like Milton Glasner, who really advocated exploration and just being always open to new ideas and experimenting and growing. You obviously would develop looks and things that you could present as a commercial marketable brand. I don't know, it's not really a brand, even a look, an aesthetic that you can lend to a project. But as an artist, you didn't want to be boxed in by that. So in my comics, a lot of the times it has to do with how the idea lands first, and then how it gets generated. So, for example, the box, the one that came out of the Tinderbox, that one has a much more traditional comic script, because I went through this lengthy process of adapting an existing story and converting it. The Therefore Repent, which was an adaptation of straight prose by Jim Monroe to graphic novel format, also went through a process of converting it into a more structured comic script. And then from those, I would do thumbnails and pencils, and then inks and whatever other finishing would be involved in the process. But for other projects, so I just did a story for the Montreal Comic Art Festival, put out an anthology,
right.
And I had a story in there. And also for my memoir projects, those usually start as bullet point notes. And then I start drawing, and as I'm drawing, I start modifying the notes, and there's this back and forth process where it just sort of organically grows. I almost never do, like, Jaime Hernandez talks about, or Jaime Hernandez, I should get that right. He talks about just writing, making up as he goes, and that's not something I could never be able to get my head around. I always have to do a little bit of initial planning and with words, and sometimes the ideas start with a single couple of pictures. Like, I'm working on a science fiction short right now that began with a visual idea. Then I had to come up with a plot to find a place for the visual idea. So yeah, it really comes down to what the spark was, and then spinning off of that.
Okay.
And then I enjoy that exploratory process of finding your way through the work, although it's probably not always the fastest. So.
Now, you mentioned that you teach part-time. So I'm wondering, do you have one piece of advice for budding comic book creators? I know you've got a lot.
Well, and I don't know, like which point to what thread to pull. One piece of advice. No. It's too complicated.
Okay.
Here's one piece of advice. Don't expect to make a living at it.
Ah.
Like you
Okay.
might, but
Mhm.
plan for probably not. Even people who end up working at Marvel, it's never a sure thing.
Yeah.
So always have your plan Bs. Always have your exit plans. So even if you do, you may like I went through Marvel. I started out learning to do comics with the goal to make a living from them in my late teens. And by the 21, I was working for Marvel, and I discovered that was not what I liked. The way it worked in the business wasn't what I wanted to be doing. So I had to back away and reassess. So even if you set out for that and theoretically get your dream job, you may find yourself surprised to find the dream job's not such a dream. So always plan for the plan Bs and the alternatives. And like comics are an upside to comics, a downside to comics and an upside to comics. Downside is, especially if you're going to write your own and draw them, but even if you just do one of those tasks, they're a very complex medium and you have to learn a lot of skills to do them well. The upside of that is you now have a lot of skills you can then transfer to other jobs. So developing plan Bs that spin out of the skills you're developing for comics is actually a pretty smart strategy and works for a lot of people. So a lot of us end up being illustrators or writers or editors or teachers or all sorts of things where we can take all the things we've learned to make this medium to do other things that people will pay us for. And then if you're really lucky, maybe your comics will sell great and you won't have to worry about it.
All right. But good to have a backup plan. I think that's what I'm hearing.
Several.
Okay. So you mentioned a lot of different projects on the go. So I'm wondering where people can find you online to find out and keep up to date with all your different works.
Well, salgoodsam.com to start with. That's an easy one. And then I'm on all of the main social media platforms. I even started a TikTok, although I don't post there a lot. And then I've been using YouTube quite a bit, so you can catch me live streaming while I work. And that just hit 10,000 subscribers, so that's kind of cool. People actually paying attention. And then you can buy my books from there's access through the .com I mentioned, but if you just look online, I've got my print books are available through Amazon and Comixology, and you can also get them from Gumroad, the ones that I self-publish, and then I guess Instagram and all that stuff. Yeah.
Great. Good.
Yeah.
Well, those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering is there something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview?
Something that didn't come up that I should mention, and probably full disclosure, because I think you won the award for the Sequential Magazine podcast, right?
I did, right. Yes.
So that's a spin-off of a project I founded, Sequential, the website. I'm the publisher for that. And that's one of those many. Well, and I technically didn't do that, so I'll explain. But like I founded that years ago. But yeah, full disclosure, anyone's listening, there was no nepotism here. But years ago, I was frustrated by the fact that if you wanted to make a living in comics, you pretty much were stuck working for an American company. And I didn't think I was going to change that overnight, but I felt like we needed to foster more of a awareness of comics within Canada so that we could develop a Canadian industry. And so I was already blogging I was the host of the Montreal Comic Jams at the time, and I had a blog for that. And I started, the blog was called the Non Sequitur blog, which is a in-joke reference to the jams. So I started a blog called Sequential, and it was dedicated to Canadian comics and news. And it's been going since 2002. Sometimes off and on, like I mostly do back end and pay for the hosting services now. And then we've got bloggers who come and go, but it's a little quiet these days. But then Brendan Montgomery approached me about doing a print magazine, which we'd flirted with years ago. We did a couple of free magazines that were presenting content we'd put on the blog and some original content, and gave them as freebies at TCAF for a couple of years.
Right.
And that was fun, but it was hard to sustain, and there was no money in it. So I ended up, after having a printing fiasco on the third issue, I decided to pack it up. But so Brendan kind of liked the idea and wanted to do something similar, so we asked about using Sequential brand. And I've always thought of it as kind of an open access platform. I didn't want it to be a top-down organization, so I was happy for anyone to come in and want to platform what they were interested in about Canadian comics. And I liked his idea, so I gave him some outlines for like what I didn't want it to turn into, but otherwise have at it. And so the magazine is actually very much Brendan's baby. He put together the awards, and so he's the one you can thank for that. But it's nice to see it evolving and continuing in new forms. And the blog is still going. We just got it. We had some hosting issues, and I had to resolve that last year, and now we're on a new host that's treating us a little better. So that's a thing. And then I'm involved in, the teaching, freelance illustrator, making my own comics, and I'm stupid. I try to make many different comic stories at the same time. It's not wise, but it's what's happening. And then I also am involved in a little bit of other stuff I'm not sure I can really talk about now, but kind of related to sequential spin-offs of trying to support Canadian comics scene in general.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, we can talk about that in the future. You never know.
For sure. Definitely small hint. Next year is the 80th anniversary of the first Canadian published comic book, Better Comics #1.
There you go.
There are plans brewing around that.
Thanks to Salgood for the chat. You can discover more about Salgood on Twitter at Salgood and online at salgoodsam.com. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please leave a good rating. Also check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website and follow along on Twitter at TrueNorthComics. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. Thanks again for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2020.